I work at a nursing home in a small town in Iowa. My usual shift is the second one, but sometimes I stay for the third shift as well. The first thing I'll tell you is that many of our residents regularly see a boy with a red balloon, and they usually see him shortly before their death. I haven't seen anything like that myself, and neither have my colleagues. But if one of the elderly residents sees him, I always hear about it. One night, I was working the night shift and walking down a long hallway with creaky floors. I entered the couple's unit to help the residents there, and to keep the main door from closing, I used a door stopper. However, the stopper fell, and I didn't bother putting it back. I just closed the door and went into one of the rooms. When I came back out, I saw that the door to the unit was slightly open, and the door stopper was securely in place. At first, I thought one of the nurses had done it, but there was no one around, and the floors in the hallway didn't creak under the steps of anyone who might have been there. When I got back to the nurse's station, where a nurse and her assistant were sitting, I asked if either of them had been to that unit. They told me that no one had gone there. This story happened about 20 years ago when I was still a child. I still live in the same small provincial town. Tourists never linger here, but that's not the point. We lived in a residential neighborhood and knew all the residents by face. We often visited each other, and those who had cars knew every scratch on them. One day, a strange blue car appeared in the yard. Nobody knew whose it was or how it had even gotten there. Weeks passed, and the car was still there. Not once did anyone see someone get into it. Everyone got curious about whose car it was. It turned out that a nephew had come to visit Grandma Betty. Grandma Betty was a lonely but incredibly kind-hearted woman. When we were kids, she would treat us to candies and pies, and no one had ever heard that she even had a nephew. She wasn't originally from here. She came from far away. Who would want to come here? Everyone thought maybe she didn't know about the nephew herself, and now he had decided to visit. People calmed down, though they were all curious to see him and ask him everything. Some nosy neighbors went to Grandma Betty's house, but no one answered the door. Everyone assumed she didn't want to open it, thinking they'd pester her with questions. Over time, people forgot about it, figuring she'd share when she wanted to. Life went back to normal, and everyone returned to their daily routines. But a couple of months later, the woman vanished. The police were called right away, and they searched the entire neighborhood but found no trace of her. And then, about once a week, the same thing started happening. Someone else disappearing. Nobody could figure out how or where they went. People grew distant, looking at each other with suspicion and hostility. Everyone saw the kidnapper in everyone else. The police eventually stopped responding to calls from these overly vigilant citizens. People panicked and started leaving the town altogether. One of these people decided to stop by Grandma Betty's house before leaving to return a chair he had borrowed long ago. He approached the door, and to his surprise, it was unlocked. Cautiously, he stepped inside the apartment, and the chair fell from his hands as he turned pale on the spot. The apartment showed clear signs of a struggle. Everything was scattered and broken. Along the walls stood jars of canned meat. But the real horror awaited in the bathroom. It was covered in blood, and next to it lay adult-sized clothing, completely torn and soaked in blood. Before he could react, something struck him on the head. When he regained consciousness, he was still in the same apartment, but the jars of meat were gone. He bolted out of the building faster than the wind. Neighbors saw him running, blood dripping from his head, his hair nearly gray, screaming, "Call the police!" After the police arrived, they conducted interviews, gathered evidence, and searched the apartment with dogs. What they discovered gave everyone chills. Everyone described the same blue car, its license plate, and the scratches on it. The police quickly tracked the car down in the surrounding area and stopped it for speeding. It turned out that this so-called nephew was actually an escaped convict. He had arrived in our town and deceived the kind-hearted grandmother. And as for the meat in those jars, well, let's just say no one needed to explain what it was. Since then, everyone who lived in our neighborhood moved away. No one could bear to stay after everything that had happened. I remember that story vividly, though, because the neighbor with the chair was my brother. He never recovered from what he saw that day and eventually drank himself into oblivion. Everything began when we started studying at the same school. This school was built a very long time ago. It is still functioning to this day. The school itself was very big, with 6 floors. 5 of them were for classrooms, and the 6th was an attic. At first, we were very upset that our school was being renovated, and we now had to be here, but later we got used to it. During breaks, we ran around everywhere, discovering new places and playing. Within a week, our class had found favorite spots. These were the attic, under the staircase on the 2nd floor, and under the staircase on the 5th floor. We liked the attic because it was huge, and we could play everywhere, and also because many ancient things were left there. Under the staircase on the 2nd floor, there was a basement with many corridors. Under the staircase on the 5th floor, there was a secret corridor that led to another floor, or even to a classroom. Everything would have been fine, but then something unexpected happened. We were playing in the attic. At first, we didn't hear anything, but then we heard something fall. We left the attic and saw that a cabinet had fallen on the stairs, but it definitely wasn't there before. This cabinet was from the cafeteria on the 1st floor. How could it possibly be on the 5th floor? That was the first oddity. The next day, another strange incident occurred. We were sitting and taking a history test. The whole class was quiet. You could only hear someone whispering, asking to copy answers. And then suddenly there was a knock on the window. We looked, but no one was there. We sat back down to continue the test, and again, a knock on the window. We looked again, but there was no one to be seen. For a week, the strange events stopped, but then they suddenly started again. We were on the 2nd floor under the staircase, exploring the corridors. We hadn't explored all of them yet, and suddenly a strong wind blew. We were shocked because all the windows were closed, and it was winter with heavy snow outside. The wind continued for another minute and then stopped abruptly. After that, we didn't feel like exploring the corridors anymore. Later, we were heading to the biology classroom. Since the lesson was about to start, we decided to quickly get to the classroom through the corridor under the staircase on the 4th floor. We were almost there when something fell. We turned around and saw a cabinet. This time it was from the biology classroom. We entered the biology classroom and wanted to tell the teacher where the cabinet was now. But there it was, standing in its place. Later, we were no longer surprised by strange things, but one thing still scared us. Some kind of scream started coming from the attic. During lessons, they would always start, and only during breaks would they stop. The screams sounded as if someone was calling for help. Several times we disrupted class and went up to the attic. When we were there, no one was around, but the screams didn't stop. Soon we got used to it, but we didn't want to go back to the attic. Where were these screams coming from? Our opinions were divided. Some thought maybe it's a ghost that was suddenly killed during a lesson right before the break. Others thought some kind of troublemaker found a good hiding spot in the attic and now screams all the time to scare people. For a week, we didn't play in the attic. Instead, we explored a few other places. But the next day of the 2nd week, the attic was locked. However, the screams didn't stop. At first, the teachers paid attention to it, but soon they got tired of it. In the summer, I often stay in a small summer house in the village. Next door, the plot belongs to an old lady who seems a bit crazy, but not violent. She spends her days sitting on a bench in front of her house, mumbling something under her breath that's impossible to make out. One time as I was passing by, I noticed she seemed to be stroking something on her lap. I thought it was a cat, but when I looked closer, there was nothing there. She was just holding her hands over her lap as if she was petting something, and one hand was gently stroking the air. I figured she must have had a cat at some point, and she was just so used to it that when she daydreams, her hand makes the motions as if the cat is still there on her lap. But one night, while I was sleeping, something strange happened. I woke up to feel my hand resting on something furry lying next to me. Half asleep, I thought it was my cat, so I started stroking it. But then I noticed the fur felt too rough. That's when I remembered I was in the village at my summer house and my cat was back in the city. I instantly woke up fully and started thinking about what to do. A plan immediately formed in my head to quickly throw a blanket over whatever it was and toss it out the window. But just as I made my first move, whatever it was jumped off the bed and went toward the door. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a silhouette, and its movement seemed strange. I jumped out of bed and saw that the front door was open. I calmed myself, thinking I must have forgotten to lock the door the night before, and maybe some stray cat or dog had wandered in. I went back to my room, walked past the window, and suddenly, outside the window, I saw the face of the old lady from the neighboring plot. I had never seen her like that before. Her gray hair was loose and blowing in the wind. Her eyes were enormous, staring right at me. I was so terrified that I jumped back from the window. She then darted back to her plot, taking huge, almost inhuman leaps. It took me a long time to calm down, but eventually I lay down and fell asleep. And just as I was drifting off, it hit me. What was so strange about that cat or dog, or whatever it was, running away? It moved as though it was rolling across the floor toward the door. In the morning, I woke up, went to get some water, and as I walked past the old lady's plot, there she was, sitting on her bench as always, mumbling something under her breath. She looked neat, quiet, and as usual, completely normal. I thought to myself that I must have dreamed about her running around like a madwoman during the night. As I passed by, I distinctly heard her speaking clearly, and as always, her hand was stroking something invisible on her lap. "Why did you make me run after you last night? Why did you sneak into the boy's house and scare him?" A chill ran down my spine, and I barely managed to stop myself from breaking into a run. I started asking around about the old lady, but no one seemed to know much about her, except that she had spent about 10 years in a mental hospital. Ever since she was released, she's been sitting in front of her house on that bench all day long. One day I was sitting with an older neighbor from the village, and he told me a horrifying story. About 15 years ago, that old lady killed her husband with an axe. When the police arrived, she was sitting on that same bench in front of her house, smiling, holding her husband's head on her lap, stroking it and talking to it.